If you've watched this show, you remember that legendary line. Little Carmine calls the Sopranos a family, and Carmine cuts him off without even thinking about it.
Family? I told you. They're a glorified crew.
It gets a laugh. You file it away as some old man being dismissive about Jersey, and you move on with the episode. Except he meant every word of it. We've spent years watching Tony run what looks like a real mafia family. He's got captains, soldiers, associates, unions, construction rackets, political connections, basically a whole hierarchy people are willing to kill over, and he sits right at the top of it. Everyone around him calls him boss. The FBI treats him like the head of an organized crime family, and Tony certainly thinks of himself that way. We're seeing Tony through Tony's world. Satriali's feels important because half the show happens there. The Bing feels like a headquarters because that's where so many of the decisions get made. Paulie, Silvio, Christopher, and the rest of the Jersey guys feel like major figures because inside this story, they are. Carmine's looking at all of it from the outside. From his chair, Tony's the boss of a small regional operation sitting next to one of the 5 families of New York. Jersey makes serious money and holds valuable territory, which is exactly why Carmine keeps doing business with them. But that money doesn't automatically buy them the same weight, and I don't think his line is a joke either. Carmine's about as deliberate as anyone in the whole show, and you almost never see him joking around in the first place. Once you separate the title from what's actually behind it, Carmine's insult starts making a lot of sense. The Sopranos are a real mafia family inside the world of this show. They've got a boss, a consigliere, captains, made men, and a whole-ass initiation ceremony. Carmine's insult isn't really about whether those things exist. It's about the distance between having them and actually carrying the kind of weight he associates with a major family. Size is part of it, sure, but the real difference shows up in how the two organizations handle money, how they protect information, how they discipline their own people, how they present their leadership, and how they survive damage. The show is drawing on a real New Jersey status problem, too. There was a real mafia family in New Jersey, one of the obvious reference points around the fictional Jersey mob. They had a boss, made men, real money, and their own territory, but the 5 families still treated them as smaller and lower status. Their size, reach, and position beside New York all mattered. That's very close to the way Carmine looks at Tony. Carmine's standard is easiest to see whenever money's involved. He runs an older, more managerial version of the mafia, one where the organization exists to make money and protect whoever's keeping that money coming in. He can be petty, greedy, ruthless, all of it, but at the end of the day, he understands the job of a boss as an institutional one. The Ginny Sack joke is the clearest example of this. Ralph makes the joke, Paulie carries it back to Johnny Sack, and Johnny becomes obsessed with having Ralph killed for it. Carmine has every reason to understand why Johnny's furious. Johnny's his underboss, and the insult was about his wife. But Carmine still won't sacrifice a huge source of construction income over one man's wounded pride. Ralph's too valuable to the Esplanade. By the end of it, Carmine's actually more worried about Johnny becoming the bigger threat to the business than he is about the insult itself. He protects the earning from the emotions of the men underneath him. Tony has a much harder time keeping those two things apart. Ralph's one of the best earners Tony's ever had, running an enormously profitable crew that becomes central to construction income. Tony also despises him. Their relationship gets worse because of what Ralph did to Tracy, because of his shitty behavior, and then finally his final straw was the horse. Years of mutual hatred was building up. When Pyomai dies in the stable fire, Tony goes straight to Ralph's house. The argument turns violent, and Tony kills him with his own hands. The show keeps real ambiguity around whether Ralph actually set that fire, and Tony's rage seems to carry the whole history of Tracy underneath it too, whether Tony's consciously aware of that or not. But the business consequence is easy to read either way. Tony's just personally killed one of his highest earners in an argument, and now he's got to hide the body from his own organization. Carmine's approach to Ralph is simple. Keep the earner alive, keep the money moving, and make the emotional guy accept the business reality. That difference tells you more about Carmine's insult than the number of soldiers on either side ever could. Johnny Sack even tells Paulie that Carmine thinks Tony and Ralph's whole generation has handled the Esplanade badly, purely from a risk standpoint. Johnny might be manipulating Paulie in those conversations, sure, but the criticism still fits everything else we know about Carmine. To him, money's something you protect from unnecessary risk. Tony's constantly creating that risk himself. Tony's unusually hands-on for a boss. He personally takes part in killings, assaults people himself when he's furious. Coco gets his teeth knocked out by Tony directly after Meadow tells him what happened. Ralph dies in his own kitchen after their argument turns violent, and Tony personally handles Tony Blundetto once the pressure from Phil becomes impossible to contain. He stays unusually close to the street-level violence that a bigger organization would normally try to keep away from its boss. Some of that's what makes Tony effective. His men know he's dangerous because they've seen exactly what he's capable of doing himself. But it also means there are fewer layers standing between Tony's private anger and the family's public problems. Carmine usually works through layers of people instead, which is one of the basic protections a mafia hierarchy is supposed to give its boss. Johnny Sack carries messages. Other men enforce the decisions. Carmine can sit across from Tony, argue about percentages, and let somebody else deal with the fallout afterward. That separation protects him, and it makes the family feel bigger than just the one man sitting at the top of it. Tony's family, more often than not, just feels like Tony extended outward. That matters because Tony's personal relationships keep shaping who gets picked for what. Christopher's the clearest case. Tony wants somebody he believes he can trust by blood, so he spends years trying to push Christopher toward a future leadership role, even as Christopher's addiction, his impulsiveness, his resentment, all of it makes him more and more dangerous to the organization. Christopher does earn his place in some ways, proves himself as a killer, but Tony's investment in him goes way past any cold assessment of who should actually be running North Jersey someday. Phil later turns that whole culture into one of his biggest attacks on Jersey, accusing them of making anybody and everybody a member. He exaggerates it, because by that point he needs Jersey to represent everything he hates, and at least one of his specific claims about their initiation ceremony is just wrong. When Christopher and Eugene get made, their fingers are pricked and saint cards are burned. The show gives Jersey a recognizable mafia induction, even if it's missing some of the ceremonial details Phil expects. His complaint does have a strange real-world echo. There are accounts of the actual Decapitation family, where John Gotti supposedly forced New Jersey members to redo induction ceremonies he thought weren't done properly. The Sopranos is borrowing that same kind of status policing, even while making Phil's blanket description of Jersey unreliable. But his broader criticism still has something real underneath it. Jersey's leadership is full of personal history like that. Tony promotes people he trusts, protects people because of family ties, and keeps coming back to this idea that blood will give him a kind of loyalty ordinary mob relationships just can't match, and that hope keeps failing him. Christopher becomes a liability. Tony Blundetto turns into a war-level problem. Junior becomes a rival. Even when Tony's just trying to protect his own relatives, it eventually collides with what the organization actually needs. New York has its own nepotism. Carmine's got Little Carmine, and Little Carmine spends half the series proving that being born into the right family doesn't automatically make you a leader. The difference is that Carmine Sr. actually knows his son's limitations. He doesn't act like Little Carmine has to inherit the whole organization just because blood makes him the obvious pick. Tony spends years trying to build that exact future with Christopher anyway. That same gap shows up in something that seems way smaller too, how these guys actually present themselves. Carmine hears that Tony wore shorts at a cookout and gives him one of the most memorable lines in the whole show for it.
One other thing, though. John said he went to a cookout at your house. Yeah. Don doesn't wear shorts.
It's funny because Tony's standing in suburban New Jersey grilling food at his own house. Shorts make total sense there. But Carmine's still thinking about The Office, and the behind-the-scenes story makes the joke even better. The writers reportedly used that exact line after James Gandolfini got some anonymous advice from someone claiming to know the mafia, telling him a real boss would never dress like that.
Anonymous call, he never figured out who it was. He answers the phone, and the guy says, listen, we like what you're doing a really good job, but know one thing. A Don never wears shorts.
To Carmine, being boss is a role you perform even when you think you're off duty. The clothes, the distance, the whole ceremony of it, the way other people have to approach you, all of that helps keep up the idea that the institution is bigger than just one ordinary man. Tony's entire life works against that. Around the house, he's in a robe, and a lot of his working day is spent hanging around a pork store or sitting in a strip club with his own soldiers, eating, gossiping, gambling, breaking balls. He's a suburban father, a guy in therapy, and a mafia boss, all at the same time, often without much distance between any of those identities at all. That casualness is honestly one of the reasons Tony's such a compelling character. It's also exactly why Carmine looks at him and sees something below his old ideal of what a Don should be. New York has plenty of crude and emotional people too. Johnny Sack loses it over an insult. Phil's crude and emotional. Little Carmine mangles half the English language. Vocabulary doesn't draw any reliable class line between them. Carmine's actual standard is more specific than that. The office itself should impose distance and restraint on whoever's holding it, and presentation is just part of that authority. Jersey treats authority a lot more like a relationship between men who've known each other forever. Tony's men joke with him, complain about him, spend long stretches in the same rooms hearing things they probably shouldn't be hearing. That familiarity makes the family feel close. It also makes information a lot harder to control. And Paulie's relationship with Johnny Sack exposes that weakness perfectly. Paulie's one of Tony's senior men. He's spent decades in the life and carries himself like someone with real standing. Johnny figures out that Paulie desperately wants recognition from New York, so he gives him just enough attention to keep the information flowing. Paulie passes along gossip, complaints, business details, all because Johnny's convinced him Carmine actually values him. Eventually, Paulie sees Carmine in person and walks up expecting to be recognized. Carmine has no idea who he is. That scene might be the purest version of glorified crew in the entire series. Paulie's important enough inside Jersey to sit near the top of Tony's organization, and the boss of an actual New York family doesn't even know his name. He's been risking his whole relationship with Tony because being noticed by New York means that much to him. That same insecurity turns Jersey into an intelligence source for Johnny Sack. The Ginny joke becomes dangerous specifically because Paulie can't keep a stupid piece of table talk inside the room where it happened. Other business information travels the exact same way. Johnny learns exactly where Tony's vulnerable, because one of Tony's own senior men just wants the approval of a bigger family. That's a discipline problem on its own, and it gets worse when you remember how many Jersey members end up cooperating with law enforcement. Pussy spends years informing. Ray Curto quietly feeds information to the FBI the whole time while staying respected inside the family. Eugene's cooperating too. Carlo eventually flips as well. The organization Tony thinks he controls through personal loyalty keeps getting penetrated over and over by men sitting right next to him. New York has informants too. Jimmy Patrill's cooperation is what helps bring down Johnny Sack, so rats are part of the larger mafia decline this whole show's describing. Jersey's smaller size makes every single betrayal hit harder. Lose one captain, one senior soldier, and you've just removed a much bigger percentage of Tony's usable organization than New York would ever lose from the same thing. You can watch that problem become visible as the series goes on. Tony keeps losing capable people, and the family just gets thinner and thinner. By the late seasons, Pussy, Ralph, Vito, Christopher, and Eugene are all gone, for very different reasons each time. Ray dies while secretly cooperating. Carlo eventually disappears into the government's hands. Some of it's betrayal, some of it's Tony's own decisions, some of it's New York, some of it's just ordinary death. But either way, the result's a leadership group with less depth every single year. New York takes enormous damage too, to be fair. Carmine dies. Johnny Sack goes to prison and dies there. The succession struggle chews through Angelo, Rusty, Doc Santoro before Phil finally takes over. But the Lupertazzi family just keeps producing people who can fill a room, lead a crew, negotiate, fight for the top spot. Jersey reaches the final war with Tony, Silvio, and Bobby, carrying a huge chunk of the organization's visible leadership between just the three of them. That difference in depth changes the meaning of every conflict between the two families. Take the HUD dispute. Carmine demands a huge percentage of Tony's scam. Tony refuses the number, pushes back, and eventually walks away with a much better deal. That matters because it shows Tony's actually capable of standing up to New York. He's got leverage. He can hurt Carmine's income right back. But Carmine can still reach into Tony's world and create pressure almost immediately whenever he wants to. New York's got access to the unions, the construction relationships, the people all around Tony's business. Tony's independence is real, sure, but it exists inside an economic system that New York's simply big enough to influence. And Tony Blundetto makes that power imbalance even clearer. After Tony B gets involved in New York's own internal conflict, he kills Billy Leotardo and wounds Phil. Tony tries to protect his cousin from Phil's revenge, but his position gets harder and harder to hold as Phil keeps applying pressure and Tony's own men start paying for it. Eventually, Tony kills Tony B himself, partly to spare him from Phil's torture, partly because protecting him any longer is putting the whole family in danger. Tony still controls the method at least. Phil doesn't get the revenge he actually wanted. But New York still created a situation where Tony can't even keep one of his own relatives alive without risking the entire organization around him. Vito takes that same intrusion even further. Vito's Tony's captain, one of his strongest earners. Tony's got his own reasons for hesitating over what to actually do once Vito's exposed as gay, including, frankly, the money Vito brings in. But Phil claims a personal stake, since Vito's married to his cousin, and moves ahead with killing him anyway. So a senior New York figure reaches straight into Jersey and kills one of Tony's own captains before Tony's even settled the matter himself. Tony's furious, and it's part of what deteriorates the relationship between the two families. His title just doesn't give him enough power to stop Phil from acting inside Tony's own organization. Coco shows you the other side of that same relationship. When Coco harasses Meadow, Tony doesn't ask New York for permission first. He just finds him and nearly kills him. That scene proves Tony's far from powerless, and that New York's made men aren't untouchable either. But it also creates another major political problem, because Tony's just brutally attacked one of Phil's people during an already dangerous stretch. So Tony can absolutely impose consequences on New York. He just has to worry a lot more about what comes back at him afterward. By the final season, Carmine's old insult basically becomes the language New York uses to explain the whole relationship. Phil repeats the glorified crew line and describes Jersey as a badly run offshoot with weak standards.
Carmine always said the Sopranos are nothing more than a glorified crew.
Butchie looks at the whole organization in even colder business terms than that. To him, New York can just remove the people at the top and keep doing business with whoever's left. And their target list tells you exactly how small they think the real leadership actually is. The hits are aimed at Tony, Silvio, and Bobby. That's it. They don't need to wipe out every made man in North Jersey. They believe killing just a few people will decapitate the organization badly enough that the rackets left over can just be absorbed or managed straight out of New York. And they almost prove it. Bobby's killed. Silvio's shot and left in critical condition. Tony abandons his normal life entirely and hides out with the remaining men, carrying a rifle around the safe house. The family that spent years looking completely solid suddenly looks frighteningly dependent on a tiny handful of people. The contrast with New York is brutal. New York's already survived Carmine's death, Johnny Sack's imprisonment and death, a succession struggle, several internal murders, another leadership change on top of all of it. The organization just keeps existing around whoever happens to be sitting in the chair. Jersey loses Bobby and Silvio, and it immediately looks close to collapse. Tony survives the war because Phil eventually loses Butchie's support. That detail matters a lot more than just saying Jersey beat New York. Butchie gets exhausted with Phil's leadership and agrees to stop the war. He gives Tony room to actually deal with Phil. Agent Harris's information helps Tony's side track him down. Phil dies, the shooting stops, and Tony's still alive. Jersey reaches peace with Bobby dead, Silvio incapacitated, and Carlo cooperating with the government, while there's no equally obvious successor to Tony anywhere in sight. Carmine understood that years earlier. His own leadership is actually what explains why his version of the insult carries more weight than Phil's ever does. Carmine treats Jersey as a smaller organization that still matters. He negotiates with Tony because Tony controls things he wants, respects his ability to earn, and knows Jersey can retaliate if pushed too far. When the business gets important enough, he's even willing to discuss enormous internal moves with Tony directly. Carmine's contempt has limits because his greed has discipline. Phil loses that discipline completely. He takes the same glorified crew idea and turns it into permission. Permission to humiliate Tony, intrude on Jersey's business, and eventually start a war over it. By that point, New York's behaving with exactly the kind of emotional recklessness Carmine used to keep in check. Johnny nearly destroys the business over one joke. Phil lets Billy's death harden into an obsession. Even New York's own succession fights turn bloody and embarrassing. The high standard Carmine actually believed in is already decaying on both sides of the river, which is what makes his line better, honestly, because Carmine's diagnosing a hierarchy that's real, even while the institution itself is rotting. Jersey's got recognizable mafia rituals, made men, profitable rackets, people willing to kill for the family. Tony holds real territory, real power, and New York keeps learning the hard way that treating him carelessly can cost them money and lives both. Carmine still sees the ceiling, though. He sees a small family whose most important businesses overlap with the bigger neighbors, a boss who's too personally involved in the violence, senior men who leak information, leadership decisions tangled up in blood and emotion, a whole structure that turns vulnerable the moment a handful of people disappear. Tony spends the whole series trying to make the title of boss feel enormous. Carmine already knows exactly how enormous the organization behind that title really is. The insult survives because the hierarchy behind it keeps proving itself over and over. Phil eventually misunderstands it and gets himself killed over it. Carmine understands that Jersey is smaller, weaker, less disciplined, and still valuable enough to respect, dangerous enough to actually negotiate with. Carmine was right about the distance between New Jersey and New York, and after watching what happens once that distance actually gets tested, I hate to admit it, but glorified crew is probably the most accurate insult anybody ever throws at Tony's family.